Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. As usual, for those who aren't sure why we're pairing all those games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so as the theory goes, diving into Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, we can understand the world a lot better and move into the game of Avowed with a full breadth of knowledge of where the game takes place and appreciate the nuances of the game, the writing, the stories, and the little moments that Obsidian are sure to put in. Today's topic has been one that I've been putting off for a while, not because it's not a good one to do, but because it is so massive in scope. And in fact, I had to cut a lot of stuff out just to make sure we could fit it in today's episode. What we're going to be talking about today is one of the gods of Eora. So as a bit of a preamble, in many fantasy settings, there is deities, there are pantheons of gods that exist for fantasy worlds, and in Pillars of Eternity and Avowed, it's no different. There is a pantheon of gods that do exist within the world, and in this one, there are 11 gods to talk about, and they all represent different domains of reality. Today's god, we're going to be talking about Eothas, god of light and redemption. Now, surprisingly, today's episode is going to feature no spoilers. For those of you who are listening, not wanting to have spoilers because you're new into Pillars of Eternity, you can listen to today's episode. For those of you who have played through the games, you might be a little surprised that there's no spoilers, considering Eothas is so tied into the narratives of the Pillars of Eternity games. But when you really get down to it, a lot of the lore that's important to learn about who Eothas is doesn't really need to spoil the story. So thankfully, a lot of those spoilers can be avoided. If there are any minor spoilers that come up, I will bring them up in today's episode. I'll give you a little forewarning, but we should be good. So today we're going to talk about Eothas, god of light and redemption.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
To understand who Eothas is, we're going to take a quick little passage out of the priest class for Eothas. So if you are new to Pillars of Eternity, it's a fantasy RPG where you get to pick your race and your class, etc., etc. One of the classes that you can pick in the game is known as priest. You can decide to play a character in the game as a priest of a particular religion that follows a god, and one of the subclass options that you can choose is in fact for Eothas. And this gives a good little description of the god of Eothas so that you know whether or not you, a potential new player, want to follow this god in the roleplay for the game. Eothas is the god of light, redemption, hope, and rebirth. The god was believed to have been destroyed at the end of the Saints' War, which we'll talk about later, but many of his priests and followers continued to worship him. His return to Eora at Caed Nua is not yet known to most mortals. Priests of Eothas are honest and kind in their dealings, and condemning all expressions of cruelty and falsehood. So there's a couple things in there that we'll talk about right away. So in this first paragraph, we get a lot about the god right away, as well as a little bit of a reference to some historical things that are going on, such as the Saints' War or a location known as Caed Nua. But the very closing statement is, I think, one of the more important ones that I want to focus on for the nature and personality of who Eothas the god is. Priests of Eothas are honest and kind in their dealings, condemning all expressions of cruelty and falsehood. We'll get into this more when we start diving into the religions that follow Eothas. But when talking about priesthoods that exist within the game, there are certain ways of behaving, certain morality structures that priests are expected to behave in, and priests are expected to be honest and benevolent, but not cruel or deceptive. But returning back to the lore of Eothas himself, Eothas goes by a number of different names. He's been known as the Child of Light, the Dawn Stars, the Shining God, the Scattered God, the Shattered God, and Gaun, Gaun, which is an alter ego of his that we'll dive more into in a little bit. His portfolio of divine domains is light, redemption, rebirth, dawn, spring, and birth. These are the things within life that represent who and what Eothas is as a divine being. As I've mentioned on previous episodes that involve the gods, it's not so much like a job that they have to do, like, hey, Eothas, you're the god of light, so you're in charge of making sure light works. It's more along the lines that light, as a natural thing that already exists in the world, somehow represents the god of Eothas. He is the god of light, not because he made light and that he's in charge of it, but he is the god of light because there's something about light in and of itself that is representative and metaphorical of what Eothas is and what he stands for, what the nature of his divine personality is. And it's like that for all of the gods. And this unique combination of light, redemption, rebirth, dawn, spring, and birth all give different perspectives on who and what Eothas is. His symbols are often a rising sun with radiant rays, or a sun rising from a starry field. And so both of those referencing kind of like sunrise, especially the one with the starry field, that is clearly referencing coming from night into day. Moving into the Pillars of Eternity guidebook, which is the official book of lore for the first Pillars of Eternity game, we can find some actual officially written lore for Eothas and read up on who he is. You can find a copy of this book on Amazon if you are interested in having it for yourself as a hard copy, but there's more than enough information on the Pillars of Eternity fandom page, or you can even get a digital copy of this guidebook if you have, I believe, the definitive edition of Pillars of Eternity on Steam. And so we have here the lore for Eothas. Eothas is actually the Adiran name for the god. Obviously, in other cultures where there are different languages, he would be under a different name. Unfortunately, I don't have any names listed here in front of me, and I can't remember exactly which ones they would be. But Eothas is the Adiran name. Adiran referencing, of course, the Adiran Empire, which is one of the oldest empires that existed for hundreds of years at the point of Pillars of Eternity. And the language of Adiran is kind of like common, what you get from Dungeons and Dragons. Everyone kind of speaks Adiran in this game. Whenever Eothas is in the mundane world in a physical sense, he is manifested in a couple of different ways. He's often represented as a young man holding a candle and wearing a crown of shining silver, or as his messengers, the Dawn Stars, which are essentially a small group of people. I think it's one man and two women, and they are shining radiantly. This is how he has been seen as physically manifest in the world. His influence over the sun and stars contribute to his overall air of grandeur and importance, putting Eothas at odds with the rest of the pantheon. And it's true, Eothas has kind of got a contention with a lot of the other gods. I don't think there's a lot of other gods that hate him outright, except for perhaps Magrin, goddess of fire and war. But, he kind of has this I'm bigger and better than you air about him, and that can kind of rub the other divines the wrong way. He likes his churches to be strictly regulated. This is a divine command that he's given. He, for instance, commands that his faithful put a candle, lantern, or torch in the middle of every room with any temples dedicated to him. And what this does is it banishes, quote-unquote, shadows of unfaithful to vacant doorways. Doorways representing Berith, one of the other gods of the world. She is the goddess of death cycles and portals, including doorways. And so this is kind of like a little ritualistic thing that Eothas divinely commands. So he already, in this little bit of lore, values the idea of ritual and metaphor in the way that you live your life, such as putting a candle in the middle of the room so you can banish unfaithful shadows towards the doors, which is supposed to represent a different god. As well as in their temples, you'll find things like doves are traditionally housed in towering rookeries. So they're usually placed at the top of the temple. These doves, which I think are like a little bit more representing purity and goodness, and crows are hunted from miles around the temple. So crows, which would represent, I think, other things like death, are not permitted, which is interesting because as we get more into the god of Eothas, you could consider him a god of death in some ways. But only in the sense of like something dying, like the dawn, not dawn, but a sunset and then coming back again. Eothas is an interesting god to look at in terms of lore and history in the world because he is such a massive character for the narratives of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, which is why this episode has been so long coming. And in fact, I can't even get everything in there, mostly because a lot of what it has to do with this area known as Rayed Saris. And so I do have to stop and tell you what Rayed Saris is before we continue on. For those who have listened to other episodes, you might have heard me mention this a few times, and I will dedicate an entire episode to Rayed Saris one day. At least I'm planning to. But in short, Rayed Saris is another colony within the new world that Pillars of Eternity takes place in. Pillars of Eternity takes place in an exciting time where it's been a couple hundred years after colonization of a new continent occurred. And you're primarily playing in the Deerwood, which was one colony that grew and eventually achieved its independence as its own nation. There is another colony far to the north known as Rayed-Saris, and they have, of course, achieved their own independence as well. The thing that's interesting about Rayed-Saris, however, is that it is a theocratic nation. It essentially has Eothasian faith as its state religion. And at one point in history, there was a man named Saint Widewin, who was apparently a Rayed-Sarin himself. He was just a farmer, but he was then inhabited by the god of Eothas, and he led a religious war from Rayed-Saris towards the Deerwood, where eventually there was this thing called the Godhammer Bomb, which apparently destroyed Widewin and the god within. This entire event is known as the Saints' War, and while we won't be talking about the full details of Saints' War and Rayed-Saris and the Godhammer Bomb today, that's all you really need to know about Rayed-Saris itself. The reason that this is important is because worshipping Eothas nowadays, at least nowadays referring to times when Pillars of Eternity happens, is not widely publicized or very popular. Because in the Deerwood, these people were victims of a religious war set against them by supposedly Eothasian people and supposedly the actual god of Eothas inhabiting another body within the world. And so while you will find worship of Eothas in other areas, such as the Aedirn Empire or Rayed-Saris, obviously, the faith is actually outlawed in the Deerwood itself, or at least actively hated by the main populace. So worshipping of this god is very risky in the Deerwood area because people don't like Eothasians or people who follow that faith. And then you can find very early in the first game a temple of Eothas that has been completely ransacked and destroyed and apparently abandoned. And so that's something to consider, especially in terms of Avowed, the game we're all looking forward to. Depending on whether or not this game is a prequel or sequel to these events in history will determine kind of how your roleplay works out or how your character could be viewed. If this game is taking place after the events of the Saints' War, then there's a chance that if you're playing a priest of Eothas, that you could run into some trouble from some people, especially if they're from the Deerwood. However, if this is happening beforehand, we might actually get to see some precursor events to the Saints' War, or actually experience it ourselves. Who knows? The game of Avowed might actually take place during the events of the Saints' War, and we'll get to see it firsthand.
Redemption. They got this whole right for when you come of age. They take you by the hand and you descend through the temple with your eyes covered, and that's supposed to be like a wicked life. They don't tell you where you're going. I was sweating like crazy when I did mine.
A lot of people find it odd and confusing that Eothas would have led a religious war against another group of people in this new colony, because he is generally looked at as a favorable god. I mean, as we said, when you're talking about someone who is a priest of Eothas, or you are a follower of Eothas, he expects you to behave honestly and benevolently, and not cruelly or deceptively. And yet, here we have Eothas, and he is leading a war against other people, which I would say is not benevolent, and is a little more cruel. And we're not even 100% sure what his motives were, at least at face value, which is a little bit deceptive. And so that leads me to wonder what is going on with Eothas that he would even do this in the first place. And this has to do with his alter ego, Gon. Eothas has a final, more intimidating aspect in the form of Gon. I'm reading this directly from the guidebook that has the lore for them. A farmer depicted as carrying a lantern and sickle. Gon is a figure of dignified, cyclical death, as opposed to Remergon's entropic variety, or Bareth's cold inevitability. So Remergon is another deity within this world. He is a god of entropy, and so when you think of death in regards to Remergon as the god of death, it's more about the finality of all life, the heat death of the universe, the slow grind of souls into nothingness, that oblivion, that's more Remergon, whereas Bareth is more about death as inevitable in the sense of it's just a cycle, circle of life. The thing dies, and then the soul goes away, the soul comes back and is reincarnated into a new body, and then that body dies, and the soul goes away, and it comes back and goes into a new body, and on it goes. Where Gon is more, I think, about the actual reaping of the souls and the actual death itself, and how like this is the event, like dusk, that leads toward the dawn. And so it is cyclical in nature, but it's more about, I think, the actual events themselves. In context, his presence surrounds the harvest, rebirth, spring, and the general celebration of mortality. His implements are symbolically important. The sickle reaps what is sown in life, and the lantern guides the deceased down their intended paths of death and rebirth. It is generally believed that Gon, instead of Bareth's avatars, visits those who embrace death with acceptance and understanding. So, and this is a picture and an idea of what Gon represents as an alter ego of Eothas. Interestingly, as I've mentioned before, if you're a priest of Eothas, you're expected to be honest and benevolent. But if you're a priest of Eothas in his Gon alter ego, so you could argue a priest of Gon, you're expected to be more stoic and rational. And Eothas is unique in that way, in that he is a god that has multiple personalities. None of the other gods have that. They don't have an alter ego. They don't have this complex personality that has different aspects to them in that way. They are kind of their own thing, but Gon is almost like a different god altogether, except it's all wrapped up in one god. You have the god of Eothas and his alter ego, which is all still one divine creature known as Gon, and it represents this other aspect of who he is. This idea being the sickle that reaps what is sowed in life. In my mind, when I read that, I think about how here you have this plant that has been harvested and is grown and it has produced fruit, and then you have this farmer coming through with the sickle that now cuts out the fruit and basically destroys the thing that was growing and that was alive. And so you've essentially killed this stalk of like corn, let's say. But in doing so, you're now, obviously taking this for food, which is going to sustain life in some other sense. And I think that's the important symbolism there. That's just kind of my interpretation of it, obviously. And that's the importance when you start considering things like the lantern guides the deceased down their intended paths of death and rebirth, which is a part of the lore that we just read. Because a lantern guiding the deceased down their intended paths, that's like the idea of people dying and their soul leaving. And what happens then is once the soul leaves the body, it's supposed to go to, we're going to call it the underworld. That's the quick way to understand it. But that's how the cycle of reincarnation works in this world. Is that your body dies, your soul leaves your body, goes to the afterlife, the underworld, the place where the gods are, whatever you want to call it. And then that soul eventually comes back, re-enters into a new body. But in order to do this, it's not all automated. These souls have to kind of find their way. And the idea with this symbolism here is that Eothas, in a sense, is harvesting these souls so that they can go back into this cycle and then come back again. Is that making sense? I'm trying not to be too long-winded, but we're trying to understand the differences and the nuances between these various gods that can represent death in different ways. Gon still fits with Eothas' character as a bringer of light, but incorporates a sense of relentlessness that proves more disconcerting than hopeful. The weak and underprivileged, while not necessarily under Gon's protection, are nevertheless under his scrutiny in case anyone should seek to do them harm. Gon is an answerer of wrongs and imbalances, or whatever he interprets as imbalance. This has contributed in no small part to Dyrwood's enthusiasm for vigilante justice, which is true, and we covered that on the Dyrwood episodes, that they are big on vigilante justice, taking the law into your own hands for the better cause, Popular regard for Gon is polarizing. He is appreciated and feared, and exudes a grim sense of finality. And this next paragraph, I think, it's just helping us to understand more the difference between Eothas, god of light and redemption, and then we have Gon, kind of like this death aspect to Eothas. And this is kind of giving you a little bit more of an idea of like Eothas is a complex divine in the sense that he's not just the happy-go-lucky good god. There is also negative aspects to it. And I think that Gon is the part of the lore written by Obsidian that recognizes kind of like the dark side that can exist with some of these things. Like, yeah, we can look at death and we can think of it in happy-go-lucky ways, but guess what? Death still sucks. And there's still something that's awful about that. And Gon represents that. And even though it's not a bad thing in and of itself, there is some negativity to that. This is my interpretation, obviously. I am kind of reading into it a little bit here. I'm giving my own commentary, so take that with you will. If you disagree with me, I would happily invite conversations about that. worldofeora@gmail.com. And I think that it is Gon's side of Eothas that allowed him to lead the religious war, to lead the Saints' War from Rhaed Saris against the Dyrwood. Because that matches more of who Gaun is. If you stop to read this item that we find within the game called Gaun's Share, this is a unique item that you have, it's a weapon. You can read the description of the weapon and you get lore out of it. At one point in the lore for this item, Gaun's Share, it says, he enjoys popularity among more rural followers of Eothas who are drawn to his varying identities as a provider, shepherd of the dead, and defender against injustice. And I think when we are talking about injustice that is viewed by whatever Eothas views as injustice, that kind of right there shows how Gaun is the one that is leading the Saints' War, because there is something that he views as unjust and is therefore able to justify himself leading the Saints' War against the Deer Woodens. What it is that they are necessarily fighting against, that might be something we save for a spoilery episode with the Saints' War and Rayed Saris themselves. But suffice it to say, Eothas has plans for why he led the Saints' War.
They take you to that reflecting pool back there, and you're allowed to look at it so you can face your sins. Then you come out into this room, and they uncover your eyes again, and everyone's there to greet you, all your friends and family. And it's like you've been redeemed. You light your candle, and it burns with the others. Never had a feeling better than that my whole life.
Because Eothas is such a complex god, there are a lot of factions and religious groups that gather together in the name of Eothas or Gaun. One such is called the Night Market, which is a secret society of extraordinarily devoted Eothasians who operate in the Deerwood. In addition to ministering to the deeds of ordinary Eothasians who cannot worship publicly, the Night Market attempts to track and fight against any dark forces that would threaten Deerwood. Their hope is in that they can mend the relationship between Deerwoodens and Eothas by performing heroic patriotic acts for the benefit of all residents of the Deerwood. However, some members of the Night Market wish to transform the purpose of the group into something quite different, an anti-Deerwood organization seeking revenge for the Battle of Halgot Citadel. So there's a lot right there. The Night Market is essentially kind of a reaction to the Saints' War on faithful Eothasians. As you can imagine, when the Saints' War was committed against the Deerwood, there were a number of people who were Eothas followers already living in the Deerwood. And this would have challenged their faith. And a lot of people probably dropped their faith altogether and instead choosing a different god that exists in the world. But there are those who are extraordinarily devoted. And what they have decided to do, at least the members who joined the Night Market, is they responded very radically in the opposite direction of the Saints' War, instead putting all of their efforts to radically do good things. So they try to perform heroic acts and patriotic acts for the Deerwood themselves, all in the name of Eothas, in a way to try to, I think, win the favor of people again. That's an example of one such faction. There is also a group of people that we learn about mostly from Pillars of Eternity 2, Children of the Dawn Stars. And this is kind of coming at from the other side of things. Like I already mentioned how there would have been faithful Eothasians in the Deerwood who are now struggling with their faith because they just watched their god commit this war against them and their people. But then you have people on the other side, on Rayed Saris, who were being led, they believe, by their god in the form of Saint Widewin. And then their god was killed. And so now they're struggling to find meaning in that, the defeat of their god. Their god was killed. Like, how do you reconcile that? And that's kind of where the Children of the Dawn Stars come from. Children of the Dawn Stars are primarily people that have fled from Rayed Saris and gone to the Deadfire Archipelago, which is the setting for the second Pillars of Eternity game. It's this archipelago of islands that range anywhere from like tundra to tropical. Like it's a big area of the world. And the Children of the Dawn Stars are essentially active, faithful Eothasians, but living in this new area after the whole events of the Saints' War. And they fled from that Rayed Saris area. So they're trying to basically start over somewhere else and learn what it is to have their faith in this new place. There were another group of people that, like the Children of the Dawn Stars, reacted in opposition to the Saints' War after the falling out of the events. And these people didn't travel to the Deadfire Archipelago like the Dawn Stars did. These people, though, the Bright Shepherds, they kind of stayed back and they stayed more on the Eastern Reach continent, which is the continent that the Rayed Saris and Deerwood colonies are on. And they stayed behind and tried to do kind of their work there to rebuild, much like the Night Market did in Deerwood, except the Bright Shepherds come from Rayed Saris themselves. So as you can see, there are a lot of factions and groups and cults that have sprung out of the Saints' War and have sprung out of the god of Eothas themselves, especially considering he has alter egos and multiple personalities. And so these are examples of different factions and cults and groups that have kind of sprung out of the Saints' War. But before the Saints' War, there was organized religion around Eothas themselves. You remember I talked about how he had divine commands, such as putting a candle in the middle of a room, or having a rookery for doves to stay in, and hunting crows for miles around any of his temples. So there was a religion formed around him, and as many religions do have, there are scriptures related to him. And you can actually find some of these examples of scriptures in the game, and we can look into these scriptures and get more of an insight of what faith of following Eothas is like. So the first example I am going to read is a book entitled Eothasian Prayer. And so this is an example of a prayer that you might utter to Eothas in the form of a book that you find in Pillars of Eternity 1. And it reads, "As the sun shall break through the darkness, the new dawn arriving with the rebirth of the day, rejoice all ye who dwelleth in the shadow, who are broken and beaten. The winter soon comes to an end. Spring shall rise, bringing light and life to the world. Radiant light, radiant life. And thy soul shall find warmth in his arms." So this first part of the prayer acknowledges the main tenets of this theology, of this faith. This idea that, and it seems to be talking about like if your life is kind of in darkness right now, or is in the middle of a cold winter, or if it's in the middle of a nighttime. The idea that the sun shall break through, the new dawn is coming, the winter will end, spring shall rise. And so it's this idea that like dark times happen, but it will get bright again. All creatures bask in his glory. The rays of his countenance bathe the world, bringing an end to the night, ushering in the day. Kneel before him and wonder at his benevolence. Feel the warmth of his radiant presence. If thou art broken, he shall make thee whole. If thou art in darkness, he shall bring thee to the light. If thou art sinful, thou shalt be reborn. If thou art cold, his warmth shall bolster thee. And I think at this point in the prayer, so the first part was kind of more head knowledge. It was kind of like more of like the theology. But then in this next set of lines in this stanza of a prayer, it sounds more worshipful. So it sounds more like adoration towards a god. And again, it's bringing forth this idea that like if you're broken or in darkness, cold, then you will be made whole. You will be brought into the light. You will be warmed. It's all these kind of positive and uplifting sides of like if you are in a negative place, you will then go to a positive place. The natural question that a lot of people might ask at this point is like, okay, but what if you're in a positive place and you go to a negative place? And I would say that that's where Gawain gets introduced into the alter ego and to the other side of Eothas. That like, yes, you do go from dark to light, but we do go from light to dark again. And so there's this idea of like enjoying the positive while you have it, but recognizing when you're in the negative that it will become positive again, but don't let that be the only thing that makes your life good. How canst I, so lowly and mourn, speak words of proper adulation? Thine eyes, whose gaze sees the sin in me, yet still shows love. Thine hands, whose grip pulls me out of darkness. Thine ears, listening to my every prayer. Thine heart, bright as the dawn, giving me warmth when I am raw. Eothas, light of spring, sun of the world, thou givest me life and purpose. Okay, so this part is definitely worship. I mean, like you have things here saying thine eyes, whose gaze sees the sin in me, yet still shows love. That's idea of being loved unconditionally by your deity, being accepted as you are, which, everybody wants, right? So like that's probably why it's in this prayer. Things like thine ears listening to my every prayer. This all has to do with how good the god Eothas is to them as individuals, right? So like we've gone from kind of general to more specific. If thine heart be black, if thine intention be impure, thy life is forfeit. For he hath seen, he can see, he will see. Nothing is hidden from his glory. His light touches every corner of the world. Nothing is hidden from his sight. If thou dost thy work in the dark, if thou wouldst keep thine actions hidden, thou shalt be burned in the sun of the new dawn. Day comes soon, prepare for the dawn. Nothing is hidden from his reach. This final part of the prayer, I think, is alluding to, it's kind of like a warning. I don't know if you're praying this, you might be praying it out loud or to yourself to try to warn yourself to not operate in the darkness. If thine heart be black, thine intention be impure, thy life is forfeit. The idea being that if you work in the darkness, if you are one with the darkness, well, when the light comes in and shines in the darkness, the darkness is put away. And if you are part of that darkness, then you are put away with that, right? So if you are one with the shadow, when the light comes, you will be expunged with the shadow. Like you will be gotten rid of, I think is what that's saying there. I could be wrong, obviously. And that's the end of the Eothasian prayer. So we have a lot of theology in there of what following Eothas is like. We have a lot of positive views in terms of like if you're broken, you will be made whole. So a lot of things like that. And also warnings, of course, to make sure you stay in the light and not in the darkness. And a lot of positive things about this god Eothas and how he cares for and loves you as an individual. This next one that I'm going to read is called 10 Years of Dawn. And this appears to be a journal entry of someone who followed the god Eothas, especially after the events of the Saints' War, with Saint Widwin being the man that was apparently possessed by Eothas himself. And it says, 10 years I tilled the Vorlast leaf, which is the main resource of Raed Ceres. It's what their economy is kind of founded on. And 10 years I told myself that living in Saint Widwin's footsteps would bring me rebirth. Each dawn I'd pray that if thou act in darkness, he shall bring thee light, and each night would bring the same emptiness. For my decade of living as a simple dye farmer, all I have to show for it is a great deal of purple clothing. Eothas has not spoken to us since he appeared as Saint Widwin. It was my hope that Eothas would claim me as his next vessel, but alas, the child of light remains silent. Every day I practice the ritual of banishing the shadows of the unfaithful, and every day I work my fields in solitude without sign of Eothas returning. If thou art in darkness, he shall bring thee light, but how long must I remain lost in this long night of abandonment? Is this my punishment for keeping my faith a secret? Is Eothas hiding from me until I shout my reverence for all to hear? He must know that the Deerwoodens now hate him and his followers. My countrymen are quick to blame all that was terrible about the Saints' War on those of us that are faithful to Eothas. Should they not be angry at the Raed Ceres soldiers? Did the Deerwoodens not realize that to dismiss the god of rebirth and redemption is to prevent all hope of healing? As I pen these words, I know that I must continue to till the dye leaf. I'll awake each day with hope. If thou art in darkness, he shall bring me light. Each day I will pray that the dawn stars visit me, just as they visited Saint Widwin in his field of Vorlis. Will they come to me as they came to Saint Widwin, as a man and two women, luminescent and perfect? I am told that they come to presage new times. I am told many things, and I struggle to find the faith to believe it all. And yet each morning the sun rises in the eastern sky, and each morning Eothas illuminates my simple plot of land, casting away the shadows of the unfaithful in his golden gaze. I thank thee, Eothas, for all the springs I've had, and all that will come. I am in darkness. Please bring me light. In a way, this entire journal is almost a prayer in and of itself. It's clearly the writings of a person who is really struggling in their faith after the events of the Saints' War, when their god apparently was blown up. And, they don't want to believe that their god has been killed, but he hasn't been heard from. He hasn't been interacted with, and he doesn't appear to be responding to any of his faithful. You got to remember that this is a fantasy world where the god's existence is well established, and connecting to your deity is a lot more of a concrete thing that you can witness in worlds like this. But it appears that there's nothing going on the Eothas side of things. He talks about things we've already discussed, how every day he practices the ritual of banishing the shadows of the unfaithful. So this man is staying faithful to the rituals even though he recognizes they're just rituals. And he constantly quotes scripture within the things. He says something like, every day I work in my fields without a sign of Eothas returning. And then he says, if thou art in darkness, he shall bring thee light. So he's quoting scripture to himself to try to comfort himself. But he's also wrestling with these ideas that the scripture poses because he's not getting anything from them. He's saying like, all right, well, I'm stuck in this long night of abandonment. The idea in theology of Eothas is that if you're in the night, don't worry. Eventually the dawn will come. Except he's like, this is a long night. Like, is the dawn coming anymore? I think is the question he's asking himself. And I'm not going to dive into every single thing about here. There is one interesting part where he talks about this thing called the Dawn Stars, which is one of the manifestations of Eothas. And this is where we get the only lore for that the Dawn Stars as a manifestation is these three people, one man, two women, luminescent and perfect, and they're usually harbingers of some sort of news or something that is to come or something that Eothas wants people to hear. But again, I'm going to cut this off here because we're going on for quite a long time in this episode. This, for me, is why I like Eothas in the game of Pillars of Eternity, because they put a lot of effort into making this faith and this religion and this god seem very authentic. Like, you have these real wrestlings that people are going through in this game. Like, this is something you might never read playing Pillars of Eternity, but if you take the time to read it, you recognize the stories that Obsidian is writing with this god and with the events of the Saints' War and how people are struggling. And I really, really value that. And I like that things like that exist within the lore, and that we might get things like that in Avowed. Which now, let's ask the question, what is Eothas going to have to do with Avowed?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
Eothas is a tough one to parse when it comes to Avowed because it depends on where in the timeline we are. If Avowed is in the events prior to Pillars of Eternity, then there's almost certainly the chance that we will run into Eothas or his followers in some way, shape, or form, because his church is widespread. He's definitely one of the more quote-unquote good gods, and so we have a good chance of running into him or his followers. However, if it's after the events of the Saints' War, especially if Avowed takes place in the Deerwood, then his faith is kind of maligned by people, and he's also not very responsive to his faithful at this point in time. So it depends on whether it's at that time or not. I would love the opportunity to play as a priest of Eothas or someone aligned with Eothas, no matter where in the timeline we are. I even like the idea of having a character that you roleplay where you're trying to wrestle with your faith in this god that isn't responding to you and apparently was killed, and also perform these atrocities that you really didn't think that they could do. I love the idea of role-playing as that. I loved role-playing as that in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and so being able to do that in Avowed is also an attractive idea to me. But I'm welcome to some new experiences as well in terms of character role-play in the World of Eora, so we'll see what Obsidian has in store for us. That's all for today's episode. I know that for those of you who are huge nerds of Pillars of Eternity, that you're like, there's so much more we can talk about. You know, the idea behind the Saints' War, like what Eothas was trying to accomplish, if anything at all, whether or not he was in St. Widewin or not. There's a whole bunch there. But I am putting that under the category of Saints' War lore, and not so much just Eothas. We've talked a lot about Eothas today, who he is as a god, how he manifests himself into the world, how his faithful live out their faith in the world. And so this episode's kind of been a catch-all for not only just Eothas, but his faithful as well. So it's kind of two topics rounded up into one. Thanks everyone for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, you have questions about today's episode, you have criticisms about today's episode, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. I love talking to you guys. I have regular conversations with many of you. Some of you aren't even on Discord through multiple Pillars of Eternity or Avowed Discord servers. I love these kind of conversations and these questions. I invite praise and encouragement, obviously. I love those, but I also invite criticism, like if I didn't get something right, or if there's something to clarify. I love that kind of stuff. If you have anything that you want to say, I can read it on the show. Worldofeora@gmail.com is where to do that. If you want to follow me on Twitter to get updates on the show or anything else that is going on, then you can follow me on Twitter @WorldofEora. I'm sure to post anything on there that is related to the show or Avowed in general. Like, you know, if something comes up in the Xbox Games Showcase this June that's Avowed related, I will definitely be posting something on there. Thanks everybody for listening. No other news to go over in the show or what's going on. I stopped playing The Last Case of Benedict Fox because I ran into a game-breaking bug which shut down my progress several hours into the game, so I just stopped playing that altogether. Dove into Redfall, which I'm going to be honest, I'm enjoying, actually. I'm having fun. Don't get me wrong. It definitely plays like a game that was designed from 2006. Like it's not up to par with its other contemporaries, but when I stop and ask myself, hey, am I having fun playing this game? The answer is kind of a resounding yes for me. I don't know why. I think the thing I just needed right now was a mindless shoot vampires in the face kind of game, you know, playing with my friends. So it's doing what it needs to do. However, I did also load up Ravenlock. If you guys are on Xbox Game Pass, that game is short and sweet and really good for farming achievements. If any of you are looking for that, if you're looking to farm achievements for Xbox Game Pass quests, Ravenlock is the one to do. It's got 50 achievements. You get one for naming your character. I think it's that easy. There's some achievements that are literally within seconds of each other. So, you know, if you're going to farm, just make sure you shut the game down between achievements. But yeah, that's all that's going on here. Thanks everyone for listening. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerito, and I'll see you guys next time.